ICU.
Why are some calling a massive influx of illegal immigrants an invasion? Why are groups of neo-Nazis and white supremacists marching in cities across the nation? What if you're tired of talking about privilege? Or just simply exhausted hearing about racism? Then maybe you've never been on the receiving end of it.
You're in the midst of a tornado. So it's not as if you can say, you know what, I don't feel like talking about the tornado right now, as a Black American. And so I don't get exhausted simply because I don't sort of see any other way to get us out of the tornado than by talking about it and facing it head on.
I'm Eddie Robinson, and stay tuned for an unguarded chat with award-winning historian and one of the leading voices for dismantling racism, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. Oh yeah, I feel you. We hear you. I see you. You're listening to ICU. I'm your host, Eddie Robinson. What's wrong with white people? Wait, maybe I shouldn't be asking that. Just saying something like that is bound to raise some eyebrows. Yeah, I know some irate emails might already be getting typed up as we speak. It seems that more and more we're not supposed to talk about race. Author and filmmaker Ibram X. Kendi asks a similar question at the beginning of the Netflix documentary Stamped from the Beginning, based on his award-winning book of the same name.
Can you please tell me what is wrong with Black people?
What is wrong with Black people?
What is wrong with Black people?
Okay, what do you mean by that?
What is wrong with Black people?
Well, nothing is wrong with any group of people, Black or white people. For too long, we have been taught that the problem is people, particularly Black people, as opposed to recognizing that the problem is policies and practices and power and the conditions that people are forced to live in.
That's the thing, isn't it? A lot of powerful folks are saying racism is over. Structural racism isn't a thing. If you're poor, well, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. If you focus too much on race, you're raising racial tensions, not fixing them. We need to talk about race because that's the only way we can tackle the inequalities in our society and to better understand why we are where we are today. Dr. Kendi is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities at Boston University and the director of the Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research. And we're so lucky to have Ibram X. Kendi joining us on ICU. We're actually coming to you from Houston's Central Library, where he just wrapped up a talk about his most recent book, Barracoon, adapted for young readers, the story of the last Black cargo. The event was sponsored by the amazing Black-owned bookstore, Kindred Stories, and the ACLU of Texas. I see you. As we welcome Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. Thanks so much for being a guest on ICU.
Of course, thank you for having me on.
So here in Texas, it's the state that is now leading the nation, if you will, in implementing an agenda to limit what is taught in schools in terms of history, the real and sometimes ugly history of how this country was created by killing and displacing indigenous people and building wealth off the labor of enslaved Africans. Political correspondents and journalists are seeing what's happening here in the state of Texas and saying things like Governor Greg Abbott is escalating this fight at the border with Joe Biden and the Biden administration in an effort to hurt desperate people, often Black and brown people, from crossing the border. Your books, have been banned already here in this state. What are we to make of this current reality that we're in, especially when we're told for years that we're living in a post-racial America?
So what's striking is, I can remember that the shooter who walked into a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, and murdered a number of people had been misled into believing that this nation was being invaded by immigrants, by immigrants from the South.
In a new statement, I want to share it with you this afternoon from the governor's desk. He says he's declared an invasion and invoking the state's constitutional authority to defend and protect itself, and it supersedes any federal statutes.
And I'm mentioning that because for Governor Abbott to continue to traffic in the very ideas that have brought harm to the people, of Texas is to me a gross hypocrisy. And if anything, it's a huge dereliction of his duties, because we're living in a moment in which I think too many people think that other people or immigrants or people who are darker skinned or people who speak a different language are invading them, are harming them, are replacing them, are the source of their pain.
The man who police say just moments earlier murdered 22 people at a nearby Walmart calmly told police, "I'm the shooter." In a newly released arrest affidavit, he spells out his racist motive, telling officers, in his words, he was targeting Mexicans.
And any elected official who's propagating those ideas is actually making people unsafe. And any elected official who's banning books that demonstrate that we're all equal, that demonstrate that we should not be prejudging people based on the color of their skin, that demonstrate that the structures in our society are the problem, not other people, are also negligent.
A Texas county tonight is threatening to figuratively blow up its entire public library system rather than bring back a bunch of banned books like a judge ordered them to do. A federal judge said it was unconstitutional to ban them and that these books needed to be put back into circulation. So tomorrow, the county's commissioners are holding a special meeting to decide whether to shut down their libraries altogether and fire the librarians.
Your latest book, and while you're here, let's talk about it. It's called Barracoon, adapted for young readers, the story of the last black cargo. This is the true life story of Cudjo Lewis, one of the last survivors of the transatlantic slave trade. This book was adapted from the book Barracoon, written by acclaimed novelist Zora Neale Hurston. Tell us a little bit about her story and why she's so significant.
Zora Neale Hurston is most known as one of the greatest novelists in American history. She wrote the classic, Their Eyes Were Watching God, but she's also known as a folklorist. So she's collected sort of particularly Southern folklore. But Barracoon in particular shows her greatness as an anthropologist, as someone who went and had a series of conversations with a man by the name of Cudjo Lewis in 1927 to learn his story. And Cudjo, to Zora Neale Hurston, was known as the last survivor of the transatlantic human trade from Africa to the United States. So he was literally walking history that she wanted to preserve his story. And she did so brilliantly and beautifully in Barracoon.
Why wasn't her manuscript ever published?
So in being an anthropologist, Zora was not just interested in preserving Cudjo's life story. She was also interested in preserving his culture. And the sound of culture is language. And so she wrote his voice in the way he expressed it. She wrote his Ebonics or his AAVE. And publishers at the time, just as many Americans do today, looked down upon the way Cudjo spoke. And they basically demanded that she take out his language. Mm-hmm. And she refused. And so as a result, the book was not published in her lifetime. She dies in 1960. The book wasn't originally published until 2018.
Wow. That's in and of itself is intense. But why is an adaptation for young people needed?
So I think there simply are not enough books for young people about slavery. And this is one of the most important periods in U.S. history and modern history. And so to me, the more books we create that allow young people to understand slavery, the better, particularly at a moment in which they're banning books about slavery, like Toni Morrison's, Beloved. But I would also say that this book sort of spans 5 major periods in African-American history, like no other book that I know of in terms of as a personal narrative. And that is Africa, So West Africa, being born and raised in an African village, in a West African village, to the transatlantic human trade that Cudjoe suffered, to, of course, enslavement in Alabama, to freedom and Reconstruction, to ultimately slavery showing up in a new form through Jim Crow. And so there's no other story that I know of, personal story, that moves through those 5 periods. And so to be able to expose young people to the breadth of history through Cudjoe's story, that's why I adapted this book.
And were you at all concerned about the trauma that many young children could be exposed to while reading a book of this nature?
I think it was my job as an author in adapting the book to ensure that no child would be traumatized by reading this book, although they would also see the times in which Cudjoe felt pain. They may feel sad. Children feel sad every day, you know. But the way that I went about doing that was I thought about Cudjoe's relationship in the book that Zora narrates with his great-granddaughters, who he adored. And I thought to myself, how would Cudjoe Lewis tell his own story, his own painful story, to his great-granddaughters? It's possible. Grandparents tell their stories, you know, every single day to their grandchildren. They tell some of the most painful stories. During Cudjoe's lifetime, there were people living like him who had experienced slavery, and they told their grandchildren their stories. There are people living in the United States who've experienced the Holocaust, and they tell their grandchildren, you know, about those traumatic experiences.
I'm Eddie Robinson, and you're listening to ICU. We're speaking with historian Ibram X. Kendi, director of the Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research and author of Barracoon, adapted for young readers. Dr. Kendi has also been named to Time magazine's annual list of the 100 most influential people in the world. I'm going to read an excerpt from the book. It's sort of like at the beginning of the book, and it gives me some impression as to what the rest of the book will be. And it reads like this: Black people should be enslaved and white people should be free. These were lies because wealthy white people enslaved black people to make money from their labor, and lots of it. And I could hear my own mother's voice in my head. You know goodness well this book is going to be banned and no one wants to hear it. I mean, this is not your first time, you know, revisiting material to bring it to younger audiences. And, you know, I'm curious, what kind of feedback, good, bad, and ugly, are you experiencing? And, you know, when people read the book, what are they saying?
I've had the opportunity to speak quite a bit over the last few weeks about this book. And I think what people are saying is that Cudjoe's story, even Zora's story of her learning Cudjoe's story,
yes,
is not only sort of powerful, but it's really instructive. And people have been telling me that just the sort of emotional roller coaster that Cudjoe sort of experienced as he was being faced with different trials and tribulations allowed them to sort of put themselves in Cudjoe's shoes. Of course, people have been mentioning just the beauty of the illustrations and the art by Jasmine Lee Johnson. People have been expressing just the pride in sort of being able to expose a child to an African village. As you know, the first part of the book is Cudjoe, you know, in his own village, you know, loving and experiencing life. So, you know, there's been a number of different educators have told me they're excited to teach this book and to create units around different elements, you know, of it to sort of use his story as almost like a central teaching tool that they could build sort of other instruction on it. In terms of the bad, I mean, I think it's the same old arguments. And it's typically that people are afraid of teaching young people about history, particularly slavery, and that, you know, this book and really no book is appropriate for that. Those of us who teach about slavery, we teach that there were white people who were enslavers and there were white people who were abolitionists. And there were white people who were neither enslavers nor abolitionists.
Yes.
And just as there were Black people who were enslaved and Black people who were enslaved who were fighting, against slavery. Of course, in teaching this history, we teach those complexities. And the hope is that a Black child will see themselves in Cudjoe's resistance, just as the hope is a white child will see themselves in an abolitionist.
Coming up, more of our conversation with award-winning author and filmmaker Ibram X. Kendi. We'll dive deep into what his thoughts are surrounding the whitewashing of historical events in schools across the nation. What is this glossed-over version of U.S. history and the downplaying of enslavement of Africans in the Americas really teaching students of today? And then later, as Dr. Kendi's books are banned across the United States, what does he think of the rise of conservative content for children? I'm Eddie Robinson. I see you. With a very intense second segment right after this. We'll be back after these messages. If you're enjoying this program, be sure to subscribe to our podcast, I See You with Eddie Robinson. You can hear all the past episodes and be notified when new episodes are released. Also, please take a minute to give us a review or comment. We love getting feedback from our listeners. You're listening to I See You. I'm Eddie Robinson. We're at the Houston Public Library in downtown, speaking with historian Ibram X. Kendi, author of the books Barracoon, adapted for young readers, Anti-Racist Baby, and his award-winning Stamped from the Beginning, which is also a documentary on Netflix. We live in a country that declares free speech is sacred, and yet book bans are on the rise. Book bans and restrictions in the U.S. rose some 33% in the last school year. That's according to a report from the free speech group PEN America. The authors whose books are most frequently targeted? Women, people of color, and LGBTQ+ authors. What's behind this push to limit what perspectives are getting taught to our children? Recently, the Florida Department of Education, along with Arizona, New Hampshire, and others, have greenlit educational materials and curriculum from various ultra-conservative groups like BJU and Prager University Foundation and many others. Texas officials have also signaled a willingness to incorporate similar materials into schools right here in the Lone Star State. For context, here's a small example of a school lesson about Christopher Columbus.
Yeah, but what about slavery? You didn't deny that.
Deny? No. Slavery is as old as time and has taken place in every corner of the world, even amongst the people I just left. Being taken as a slave is better than being killed, no? I don't see the problem.
Well, in our time, we view slavery as being evil and terrible.
Ah, magnifico. That's wonderful. I am glad humanity has reached such a time. But you said you're from 500 years in the future? How can you come here to the 15th century and judge me by your standards from the 21st century? For those in the future to look back and do this is, well, estúpido.
Dr. Kendi, I really want to get your thoughts on this whitewashing of historical events and narratives, of denying any valid criticism of figures of the past. I mean, it just seems like it's gaslighting on some level. I mean, do parents have to take more of an active role in ensuring their cultural histories are not erased? I mean, do parents even have any power to make sure books like yours make it into the curriculum? I mean, what action needs to take place in your mind?
So to me, any elected official or educator who is taking books off the shelf, who is not ensuring that our children have an accurate rendering of history, who are not ensuring that our children are exposed to different cultures and different peoples in a multicultural sort of world, from my standpoint, is certainly not a supporter of parents. And it to me, it doesn't make sense for parents to allow people who are not supportive of them and their children to teach their children, right? I mean, Malcolm X extended this further and once said only a fool would allow their enemies to educate their children. And so what that means is that I think parents recognizing that they want their child to grow up viewing different racial groups as equals, not thinking of themselves as their child as superior and inferior. A parent who wants their child to be able to navigate in a multiracial, multicultural world has to be much more active in ensuring that child receives an anti-racist education. Because in many ways, we have too many elected officials who are trying to systematically preserve or institutionalize a racist education. And you ask, why is this happening?
Yes.
There are a number of different reasons. I think first and foremost, in the summer of 2020, when we were engaged in demonstrations against racism, around this country,
Sure.
Around Texas, it wasn't just older people who were engaged in those demonstrations. There were younger people who were saying to their teachers, who were saying to their principals, who were saying to their parents, they want to understand more about racism. They want to understand more about other groups. They want to diversify their curriculum. They even engaged in demonstrations at schools. And so some schools responded, as they should, to the desires and demands of their students who were demanding a deeper and fuller and more diverse educational system. And so then as soon as schools started responding with doing their jobs, being responsive to young people demanding to want to learn, so we're going to actually provide you with that education, then you had a reaction. You had people who wanted to preserve an educational system where race and racism are not taught, wanted to preserve an educational system where white people are the primary subjects, of analysis. And they have been engaged, in that work ever since. And it's better for elected officials who thrive on particularly white Americans believing that the source of their pain are people of color, to get them thinking that people of color are going after them, so that, when there's emergencies in the state of Texas, white people will blame people of color, and then elected officials can just flee to Mexico and other places on vacations, right? Because nobody's going to blame them because they've already taught people to blame people of color.
Here you are coming from Jamaica, Queens, New York City, how vibrant that city is. But let's go back. How did you get immersed in all of this work? Where did this come from? This love of history, to embrace history. Where did this come from?
I think when I arrived in college at Florida A&M University, no offense, Texas Southern or Prairie View.
A&M's in the house for sure. Continue, please.
But, when I went to FAMU,
yes.
I think I went there wanting to understand what the problem was. And I think too often I had been taught that the problem was Black people. If anything, I went to college thinking that the problem was Black people. And so and ironically, I think within a few weeks of being at FAMU, I was in Tallahassee for the election of 2000, when a number of different, particularly Black votes were suppressed and were thrown out. And of course, George W. Bush sort of barely wins the state of Florida and thereby wins the presidency. And so I heard first and second hand stories of Black people who were unable to vote. And so again, I went to college thinking Black people are the problem, but then I had a front row seat to one of the greatest crimes of voter suppression, in American history. And so I sort of caused me to be like, okay, maybe Black people are not the problem. Maybe something else is the problem. Yeah. And I essentially went on an intellectual search to realize what that problem was, and ultimately learned it was racism.
What's been the most excruciating incident that's happened to you, or perhaps even happened for you? Whether it's discriminatory or something that was disrespectfully said to you, describe an incident of what happened, what transpired, and why has it stuck with you to this very day?
So there's an incident I narrate in my book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, that I think was pivotal in my own development, because I think that at the time, I believe I was a senior in college, and at that point, I had recognized more and more the problem of racism, but I still had some lingering thoughts that the problem was Black people. And I ended up writing this piece in the FAMU student newspaper that was highly critical of, white people. And I was also interning at the Tallahassee Democrat, and the editor of the Tallahassee Democrat, who was a Black guy, sort of brings me into his office to basically question me about this piece, because a lot of his readers, particularly his white readers, had called him outraged that one of his writers was writing such harsh words about white people. And so in the midst of our conversation, at one point, he says to me that, I have a nice car, and I hate it when I get pulled over like I'm one of those N-words.
Okay.
And the reason why that specific moment had an effect on me was less because of what I saw in him and more in what I saw in myself. In other words, here he was being subjected to police racial profiling, and he was turning around and claiming Black people were the problem, right? At least in part. And basically that's what I was doing. I was explaining times in which I had been subjected to racism as somehow the fault of other Black people. And so it put up a mirror to myself. And of course I had to face myself, and I didn't like, what I saw. And ironically, that article is being used, currently by those who are trying to conserve racism today to claim that I'm anti-white and to claim that anti-racism is anti-white. How did they learn about that article? Because I wrote about the article in How to Be an Anti-Racist and described how the ideas in that article were problematic.
This is ICU. I'm Eddie Robinson. We're chatting with Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. He's the director of the Center for Anti-Racist Research at Boston University and the author of many, many books. But his most recent one is Barracoon, adapted for young readers. The reason why you're here in my mind has to do with your Netflix documentary. Groundbreaking, might I add. And I have to ask this because there were several incidents that occurred in the actual documentary I want to get your insight on. Phyllis Wheatley. Phyllis Wheatley being the first Black woman to publish a book of poetry in pre-19th century America. A group of prominent white men from Boston gathered to investigate in an effort to ascertain whether or not she in fact wrote those poems.
But of course, you had some people that were like, those poems couldn't have been written by this Black girl. That's crazy. That is just impossible. And so as a result, a group of prominent Boston white men gathered together to investigate. And they brought Phyllis Wheatley before them to really ascertain whether she actually was the one who wrote those poems.
And you correlate that incident of Black women constantly having to prove their worth along with the notion that white men have the right to ask women to prove their worth. One of your cultural experts in the documentary says every Black woman has a Phyllis Wheatley moment. In the piece, as examples, we see Anita Hill and her sexual assault Senate hearings in 1991.
Senator, I would suggest to you that for me, these are more than mere allegations.
How sure can you expect this committee to be on the accuracy of your statements?
There's the confirmation hearing of the first Black woman nominated to the Supreme Court, Senator Ted Cruz, bringing in books you had written in this hearing of the first Black woman nominated.
They include a book called Anti-Racist Baby by Ibram Kendi. And there are portions of this book that I find really quite remarkable. One portion of the book says babies are taught to be racist or anti-racist. There is no neutrality. Another portion of the book, they recommend to babies confess when being racist. Now, this is a book that is taught at Georgetown Day School to students in pre-K through second grade, so 4 through 7 years old. Do you agree with this book that is being taught with kids that babies are racist?
Senator, I do not believe that any child should be made to feel as though they are racist or though they are not valued or though they are less than, that they are victims, that they are oppressors.
This was really fascinating to me because I see all of this. And I often think of my NPR colleague, Aisha Roscoe. She's the host of Weekend Edition Sunday.
Wherever I go and whatever I do, I am a Black woman.
And she's oftentimes criticized of her voice, her articulation, her dialect, her delivery over the air because she sounds a bit too ethnic from what some critics have said.
There are certain things I say where people will know that I'm Black. Some people will say, oh, you've kind of turned up your Blackness. But it's not like I'm turning it up or turning it down. I'm just talking more casually. Whatever I do, I'm myself, because that's the only person I know how to be.
I'm a Black man, but I remember when you say that every Black woman has a Phyllis Wheatley moment. I've had some Phyllis Wheatley moments myself, because I remember when I was hired at WNYC, editors there were criticizing my voice, my articulation. It was too commercial, too top 40 Power FM, because in their minds, they needed soft intellect, very non-aggressive, non-abrasive, non-sensationalistic, white sounding. I wasn't hype or hip, but I wasn't mild and I wasn't easy. What are you to make of all of this that's still going on, Professor? And it's happening to this day that our voices are to be measured a certain way, even through mediums that people can't even see us, through audio.
I actually think that is another reason why what Zora Neale Hurston did, who had her own Phyllis Wheatley moment after writing Barracoon, and people telling her that it didn't measure up, precisely because they criticized Cudjoe's voice, called it too, ethnic. So she walked away, right? She walked away from publishing. She wasn't going to prove, the worth of retaining Cudjoe's voice in her own. But unfortunately, I think we live in a society that calls itself or imagines itself as multicultural, but actually doesn't truly practice multiculturalism. And what I mean by that is, if we understand cultures as one aspect of culture being language, then what that means is we should understand ourselves as a multilingual society in which multiple languages are accepted and respected, and multiple forms of English are respected and protected. But that's not the case, right? And I think it demonstrates that we don't live in a multicultural society. I think it also demonstrates that Black voices are being measured and judged against the sort of quote unquote standard white voices. The closer we are to those voices, the better. The further away, the worse we are. And I don't think people realize those are racist ideas.
Coming up, we wrap up our chat with one of the most influential historians in the country, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. We continue to explore his Netflix documentary that's based on his award-winning book, Stamped from the Beginning. We touch on a very controversial topic discussed in the movie, the myth of Black hypersexuality and how racist narratives were constructed to justify violence towards Black women. But How do you explain the graphic sexualization of popular black women in today's hip-hop culture? Where do we draw the line between expression and marketing when popular female artists incorporate sex into their music? Plus, as many of us continue to grapple with the impacts of racism daily, we'll ask the author, how can white people support the efforts of blacks in a struggle to achieve equality? I'm Eddie Robinson, a captivating final segment of I See You that you do not want to miss. We'll be right back.
If you're enjoying this program, be sure to subscribe to our podcast, I See You with Eddie Robinson. You can hear all the past episodes and be notified when new episodes are released. Also, please take a minute to give us a review or comment. We love getting feedback from our listeners.
You're listening to I See You. I'm your host, Eddie Robinson. We're coming to you from the beautiful downtown Houston Public Library, speaking with historian Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. He just wrapped up a book talk about his most recent one, Barracoon, adapted for young readers. Now, this book is an adaptation of the story of one of the last survivors of the transatlantic slave trade, as told to legendary writer Zora Neale Hurston. The subject of the book is named Cudjoe, and his story really got me thinking of the idea of justice. He was kidnapped from his homeland, transported under inhumane conditions across the ocean, and then enslaved to work under unimaginable conditions.
I'm a subscriber of karma, and there's something really satisfying when karma happens and when it takes place. When we speak of folks from the past, for instance, the Portuguese Prince Henry and their initial involvement in the African slave trade, the concepts and ideologies of how blacks were seen as beasts and animals, the inferiority of it all, Professor, I can't help but wonder, will blacks finally get their due? Will there be a moment in time where the script is flipped? The inheritances, the heirs of those who embraced and earned money from slavery. Can there or will there ever be a sense of repatriation? Will Europeans ever reap what they had sown in constructing this tapestry of racial hierarchies? Will there ever be a repatriation of ideals, Professor, on a global scale, of that indoctrination, if you will? What does karma look like for all of this?
Well, I actually think it's important, for us to understand that let's say the enslaver didn't just inflict terror. The enslaver had to live in fear because he knew he inflicted terror. In other words, the enslaver had to sleep with guns for pillows. And, just as when this nation went to war over slavery, in the Civil War, it led to more deaths than every other American war combined until recently. And most of those people who died were white. And the irony is you had Confederate leaders who created laws that allowed themselves to buy themselves, out of service, and then drove, into their army largely, many non-slaveholding whites. I'm mentioning this because that sort of level of fascism, engaged in by enslavers, have led to all sorts of sort of death, even among white people. I mean, even the one of the greatest fascists of the 20th century, and Adolf Hitler, and helping to sort of initiate the Second World War, that led to a number of people dying, tens of millions of people, dying. I'm mentioning this because certainly, Black and indigenous and brown people and Asian Americans have suffered as a result of racism, as a result of slavery and colonialism. But many white people have suffered too, in a collateral way. And so we've all suffered. But I think because white Americans don't know their history, and they don't know their history of suffering at the hands, of powerful white enslavers and segregationists who were passing poll taxes that made it hard for white people to vote if they didn't have enough money. I don't think it's common knowledge that in many ways karma has already happened, which is part of the tragedy, of it all. But I would also add that, because you asked sort of when Black people will get their due.
Yeah.
Prior to the era of enslavement in West Africa, there emerged these massively powerful and wealthy empires, the Ghana, Mali, and Songhai empires. And these empires and the people who led them were among the most powerful and richest in the world. Mansa Musa, who was one of the major leaders of the Mali, empire, was reportedly the richest and most powerful person in the world at the time. And they were able to mine in gold, which is what allowed them to gain so much riches. There were non-Sub-Saharan Africans who traveled into Songhai, into Mali, and would write back that relative to their nations, there's almost no violence and harm here. These are highly sophisticated societies that these African people have created. So I think if we take a long view of history, and we actually see that there was centuries of time in which people of African descent had built some of the most powerful and sophisticated and wealthy societies, in the world. And of course, we know the ancient Egyptians were of African descent, right? And most people know the first human civilization that they created.
How can white people support the efforts of Blacks in their struggle to achieve equality today?
Well, I think sort of adding a pin to, I think, a few different comments that I've made, I do think it is important for how white people approach working with Black people, particularly working with Black people to challenge racism. I don't think white people should approach it from the standpoint of guilt. I also don't think it's the most effective for white people to approach it from the standpoint of allyship. In other words, I'm coming to help you. It's not going to help me any. I think it's most effective for white people to approach anti-racist work with Black people from the standpoint of being a comrade. So they begin to recognize the ways in which, Governor Abbott has used voter suppression to stay in power. And now his policies are not just harming people of color, but white Texans.
Governor Greg Abbott signed a proclamation limiting voters to one drop-off location per county.
They begin to recognize the ways in which racism has had a collateral sort of impact, on them. They begin to recognize the ways in which racist dictators are dividing and conquering through racist ideas, the ways in which they're convincing white people that their nation is being invaded and the jobs are being taken away, when it's those wealthy people who they support who are actually taking their jobs.
This is ICU. I'm Eddie Robinson. We're at the Houston Public Library with Dr. Ibram X. Kendi.
Stamped from the beginning. It's a very intense documentary. It also talks about the hypersexuality of Black women, highlighting the false idea of the Black Jezebel, an idea that Black women were innately promiscuous as a means to erase the sexual violence that was fundamental to the violence of slavery.
This was supposed to be a Black woman who was completely controlled by her sexual appetites. She was innately predisposed to always be hypersexual and want to engage with sex.
It also examined the complex and complicated legacy of Thomas Jefferson, an enslaver who wrote publicly in opposition of both slavery and the abolition movement, while he repeatedly raped an enslaved teenager, who would eventually give birth to 6 of his children.
You really want me to talk about Thomas Jefferson? Okay.
Thomas Contradiction Jefferson.
There are few people I despise more.
I really want to ask this with a very respectful tone, but I have to ask this as I was watching that part of the documentary. What are we to make of the current popularity of Black women in hip-hop? When it is extremely popular, we see Megan Thee Stallion. We see Sweetie.
That my best friend. She a real bad, she got her own money.
We see City Girls.
Slim with a real big booty. I'ma drop it like it's hot, like I'm Juvie. Throw it back, got on bustin' like a Every time I'm on the scene, it's a movie. No ways, pretty face, make 'em work for it. Put that be on his face, make 'em work for it.
You know, in essence, they're one of my favorite acts. I'm not going to be judgmental here. But what are we to make of that? What they are presenting to culture?
So this is an incredibly complex issue because I think on the one hand, Black women artists should have the power and ability and freedom to express themselves however they want to appear and create sort of expressions in any way they see fit. On the other hand, as we show in Stand from the Beginning, you know, Black women are, like Black men, hypersexualized. And it's imagined that what sort of, as we showed in the film, that sort of Black women are sort of these sort of sexual divas. And so then when a Black woman wants to express her sexuality, people don't see a person expressing their sexuality. They see a hypersexual Black woman. And so it creates a situation because then if you're a Black woman artist and you want to express your sexuality while in the midst of this sort of trope, like what do you do? Right? And I think it creates a challenge because I think on the one hand, people could become popular in that way. But then on the other hand, Black women should be able to express themselves sexually. And I think that's part of the challenge. And so I actually don't know the answer to this question because I think it's incredibly complex.
So complex. And it even kind of gets into a segue of my next question to you is, as a human, you know, do you ever get exhausted in talking about this subject matter, talking about race, talking about the impacts of racism, talking about, you know, everything as it relates to this? Do you ever get exhausted?
I don't, and I think it's because it's equivalent to, like, let's say if we're in the midst of a tornado and that's your experience, like that's literally, you're in the midst of a tornado. So it's not as if you can say, you know what, I don't feel like talking about the tornado right now. And so I'm not just a scholar of racism, I'm also having to face racism, you know, as a Black American, and particularly as a sort of a Black public figure in which people use me and other Black public figures as these boogeymen and women to sort of scare white folks. I also have to sort of, you know, deal with that. And so, I don't get exhausted simply because I don't sort of see any other way to get us out of the tornado than by talking about it and facing it head on, and figuring out, how to eliminate it.
Of all the books and the stories you've written, the projects you've accomplished, the work that's left to be done, you're a professor of history, Dr. Kendi. You're a best-selling author, a father, a husband, a brother. You're a much sought-after guest speaker. People are around listening to this interview and they're like, we have to move, Dr. Kendi, let's go. But throughout the course of your career and all that you've accomplished, what lessons have you learned about yourself thus far?
I think that I've learned that I continue to strive to want to learn more and to want to grow and want to change. and want to sort of revisit and refine the way I think about the world, the way I think about particular people, the way I think about certain structures. And so I've learned that the more that I am focused, on growth, the better professional and person, that I can be. And whenever I get sort of stuck, in a particular sort of way of thinking, that's probably not what's best for me. And then I think simultaneously, I've also learned that to not really sort of take myself seriously. And what that means is not just being able to sort of joke on myself and, kid myself. But what I've also learned is that in a moment in which there are political operatives who are trying to misrepresent me, to misrepresent anti-racist work or even Black people, I can't really take what they're saying about me seriously. I can't take it personally, because if I take it personally, then it's going to be hard for me to continue to do this work, and I'm going to be sort of constantly battling or engaged in these personal battles when it was never really about me, and it was always about these larger issues.
He is Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. Thank you so much, Professor, for being a guest on ICU.
Of course. Thank you for having me on.
Our incredible team includes Technical Director Todd Holzlander, producers Laura Walker and Micho Jacob. We had help this week from Kindred Stories and the Houston Public Library. ICU is a production of Houston Public Media. Visit us at iseeushow.org for more about this week's episode and links to our social media channels. I'm your host and executive producer, Eddie Robinson. And I feel you. We hear you. I see you. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time.